David hadn't set foot in his parents' attic in years. The dusty, cramped space was full of old boxes and forgotten belongings, each coated in a layer of neglect. After his father's passing, the responsibility of clearing out the house fell to him. As he sorted through photo albums and childhood toys, one box stood out. It was labelled in black marker, "For your eyes only." Curious, David pried it open. Inside were dozens of VHS tapes, their labels scrawled with dates spanning decades. Some were from his early childhood, others as recent as last year. His brow furrowed. He couldn't remember his family owning a camcorder, let alone making so many tapes. That evening, David set up his old VCR. The first tape was innocuous enough. Him as a toddler playing in the backyard. His mother's voice could be heard laughing, coaxing him to take a few wobbly steps. He smiled, nostalgia washing over him. But the next tape unsettled him. It was footage of him alone in his room. No other voices, no obvious cameraman. The camera lingered on his sleeping form, the lens zooming in, as if the person behind it wanted to memorize every detail of his face. David turned off the tape, his heart pounding. Was this a prank? He checked the box again. The dates were sequential, covering years of his life. He played another tape. This one labelled "First Day of School." It wasn't a proud parent's view of their child boarding the bus. Instead, the camera watched from across the street, hidden behind bushes. It followed him walking with his backpack, glancing nervously at other kids. The realization hit him like a punch. These tapes weren't made by his family. Someone had been following him for decades. Each tape he played revealed more chilling footage. His soccer games, his high school prom, even quiet moments in his room where he thought he was alone. Whoever made these tapes had access to places they never should have. David's mind raced. How had they entered his home? Who could have been this close without anyone noticing? Then he found the last tape. Its label read simply, "Now." His hands trembled as he slid it into the VCR. The screen flickered to life, showing a static shot of his living room, his current living room. The camera was positioned at an angle he recognized immediately. It was from the corner near the bookshelf. On the screen, he saw himself earlier that day, sorting through the attic boxes. The camera zoomed in slowly as he found the tapes, lingering on his confused expression. David's breath quickened. The footage jumped, showing him now, sitting in front of the television, the glow of the screen illuminating his pale face. His eyes darted to the corner of the room, but it was empty. The camera's perspective didn't match reality. It was as if the tape was still being recorded. Suddenly, a new sound crackled from the television. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they echoed, not from the tape but from behind him. David froze. The floorboards creaked, the sound closing in. He reached for his phone but knocked it to the floor in his panic. His eyes darted to the dark hallway behind him, his heart pounding. "David!" A voice rasped, low and hoarse. He turned, his eyes locking on the shadowy figure standing just beyond the doorway. The man was gaunt, his face obscured by the dim light, but the lens of a camcorder glinted in his hands. The red recording light blinked steadily. David backed away, his legs trembling. "Who are you?" he managed to choke out. The man stepped closer, raising the camcorder to his face. He didn't answer, but his voice came from the TV instead. "I've always been here." The lights flickered, and David bolted for the front door. It wouldn't budge. He fumbled with the lock, his hands slick with sweat. Behind him, the camera's whirring grew louder, drowning out his panicked breathing. When the police arrived hours later, the house was empty. The box of tapes sat neatly on the coffee table, and the TV was off. David was gone, his car still in the driveway. In the corner of the living room, mounted on a tripod, was a camcorder. Its tape was labelled simply, "Finale." Emma had always been cautious about her privacy. Moving into her first apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. No nosy neighbours, no roommates borrowing her things. The building wasn't fancy, but it was quiet, nestled in a neighbourhood where people kept to themselves. It seemed perfect. Her excitement turned to unease when, during her first night unpacking, she found something strange. While changing a light bulb, she noticed a small, dark lens embedded in the fixture. A camera. Her stomach dropped. She ripped it out and stared at it in disbelief. Who would put a camera here? She told herself it was left over from a previous tenant, a prank or some sort of sick joke. Still, she called the landlord. "It's nothing to worry about," he said dismissively. "Kids these days think it's funny to spy on each other. I'll have maintenance check the rest of the place." Unsatisfied but too tired to argue, Emma decided to let it go. The next day, she carried on unpacking, trying to shake the nagging feeling that she wasn't alone. She covered the windows with thick curtains and started checking every corner for hidden cameras. She didn't find any more, but the sense of violation lingered. A week later, a package arrived. There was no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a note. "You've been my favourite project." Her hands trembled as she plugged the drive into her laptop. The first file was labelled Day 1. It showed Emma walking into her new apartment, the footage taken from an angle high above. She felt a chill. This was from the camera in the light fixture. The next clip showed her unpacking boxes, humming to herself, unaware she was being watched. Each video documented her daily routine, brushing her teeth, making coffee, lounging on the couch. By the time she finished watching, her breath was shallow, her heart racing. Someone had been spying on her, and they wanted her to know. She called the police, who took the footage seriously, but found no leads. "It's likely an ex-boyfriend or someone you know," one officer suggested. But Emma had no history of stalkers or abusive relationships. She changed her locks and installed her own cameras. For a while, things seemed to return to normal. Then another package arrived. This one contained a single photograph. It was her, as a child, playing in her backyard. Emma's heart stopped. She recognized the house immediately. It was her childhood home, and the photo was taken from behind the bushes. She turned it over. Written on the back were the words, "Since the beginning." Emma's mind raced. Who had been following her all this time? She called her mother, desperate for answers. "Did you ever notice anything strange when I was growing up? Someone watching us?" Her mother hesitated. "Well, there was that one neighbour, Mr. Klein. He always seemed interested in you, but he moved away years ago." Emma couldn't sleep that night. Every noise made her jump, every shadow seemed to move. The next day she searched online for Mr. Klein, but there was no trace of him, no address, no death record, nothing. Another package arrived. This time, it was a collection of DVDs. She hesitated, but curiosity won out. The first video showed her college dorm room, footage taken from hidden cameras. The second was from her childhood bedroom, her teenage self scribbling in a diary. Each clip was more invasive than the last, showing moments Emma hadn't even remembered. The final DVD was labelled Tomorrow. Emma pressed play. It showed her, sitting at her kitchen table, exactly as she was now. The video continued, showing her getting up to answer the door. A man stepped inside, his face obscured by shadows, and she froze as he moved closer to her on the screen. A knock came at the door. Emma's body went cold. The knock came again, louder this time. She backed away, grabbing her phone. Before she could dial, a voice called through the door. "Emma, it's the police. We received a tip about suspicious activity at your apartment." Relief flooded her. She opened the door a crack, but the man on the other side wasn't in uniform. He smiled, his teeth yellowed and uneven. "Gotcha," he whispered, shoving the door open. The phone clattered to the floor as Emma tried to fight him off. He pinned her down, murmuring about how long he'd waited for this moment. "You've been the perfect subject," he said, his breath hot against her ear. "But every project needs an ending." The next day, the police found her apartment empty. The only clue was a USB drive left on the counter. It contained a single file, Final Cut. In it, Emma sat in a chair, her eyes wide with terror as the man stood behind her, holding the camera. The video ended abruptly, the screen cutting to black. Mark first received the email late at night. The subject line read, "You've been featured." Assuming it was spam, he almost deleted it, but the sender's name caught his eye. The archivist. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened it. Inside was a single link with no accompanying text. Against his better judgment, he clicked it. The link took him to a minimalist website, a black background with a single folder labelled Mark's Life. Mark's pulse quickened. He hovered over the folder before clicking. Inside were hundreds of video files, each named with a specific date. Some went back decades, others as recent as last week. He clicked on one dated years earlier, when he was in high school. The video showed him at the bus stop, headphones on, oblivious to the world around him. The camera followed him as he boarded the bus, zooming in on his face through the window. Mark stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. He had no memory of anyone filming him. The next file was from college, him in a coffee shop, reading a book, the camera positioned from across the street. The videos spanned every stage of his life: graduations, quiet moments at home, walks in the park. Each one was taken without his knowledge, the angles too deliberate, the focus too precise. Panic set in. He searched for the site's origin, but the URL was untraceable. He closed his laptop and paced his apartment, his thoughts racing. Who was doing this? And why? The next morning, another email arrived. The subject line read, "A fan of your work." Mark hesitated before opening it. The message was brief. "You've made so many mistakes. I've been watching. Let me help you fix them." Attached was a new video. This one was different. It showed Mark arguing with a former co-worker outside their office building, an altercation that had nearly cost him his job. The camera angle shifted, revealing the co-worker storming off. Text overlaid the screen. "You let him win. Weak." Mark slammed his laptop shut. His heart raced as he double-checked the locks on his doors and windows. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Over the next few days, the emails kept coming. Each one contained a video paired with a critique of his life choices. "Why didn't you confront her?" accompanied footage of his breakup. "You let them walk all over you," paired with a clip of him being passed over for a promotion. The archivist was cataloguing his failures, mocking him with evidence. Mark went to the police, but without a clear source for the videos, they couldn't help. Frustrated and terrified, he stopped going to work, retreating into his apartment. He installed security cameras, hoping to catch whoever was stalking him. But the emails didn't stop. One night, Mark received a live link. The title read, "Now." He clicked, his hands shaking. The feed showed his own apartment, the view from a camera he hadn't installed. The archivist was watching him in real time. Mark's throat tightened as he scanned the room, looking for the hidden lens. He ripped apart picture frames, overturned furniture, and tore through the vents, but he couldn't find anything. The live feed continued, capturing his every frantic move. The screen flickered, and a new angle appeared, this time from his bedroom. Mark froze. The camera was positioned at his desk, where he'd spent countless nights working. His chest heaved as he stared at the screen, unsure of what to do. Then the feed cut to a black screen with a single line of text. "It's time we meet." A loud knock echoed through the apartment. Mark grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands trembling. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Silence. The knock came again, louder this time. He approached the door cautiously, knife raised. "Go away!" he shouted. He peered through the peephole but saw nothing. Gathering his courage, he flung the door open. The hallway was empty, save for a small USB drive lying on the floor. He picked it up, his palms sweating, and plugged it into his laptop. A single video file appeared, labelled "The End." Mark hesitated, then clicked. The video showed him opening the door moments earlier, the footage taken from just outside his apartment. It zoomed in on his face, capturing the fear in his eyes. Then the angle shifted to show a figure standing behind him. Mark spun around, but it was too late. A hand clamped over his mouth, dragging him backward into the darkness. The next day, Mark's apartment was empty. His laptop sat open on the desk, the screen displaying a single folder labelled Mark's Life. Lauren loved her new neighbourhood. After years of moving between cramped city apartments, her suburban house felt like a dream. It was cosy, with big windows overlooking a quiet street. Her neighbours were friendly, but not overly intrusive, giving her the perfect balance of community and privacy. Privacy. She thought about that word often as she stood in front of her living room window, sipping coffee and watching the world go by. Across the street was a house she hadn't seen anyone enter or leave. Its curtains were always drawn, the porch covered in dead leaves. The neighbours claimed it had been vacant for years, though Lauren often thought she saw movement through the windows. Just the flicker of a shadow or a sudden shift in the curtains. One evening, as she sat reading in her living room, she felt it again. The sensation of being watched. Her eyes drifted to the house across the street. In one of the windows, a faint glow flickered. A television, maybe. She squinted, but the light disappeared. Shrugging it off, she returned to her book. The next morning, a package sat on her porch. There was no label, no return address. Inside was a USB drive. Lauren hesitated before plugging it into her laptop. The drive contained a single video file titled, "For Lauren." Her stomach tightened as the video began. It showed her, sitting in her living room the night before, reading her book. The angle was from above, as if someone had been filming from the ceiling. She froze, her breath catching. The footage shifted to show her brushing her teeth in the bathroom, then sleeping in her bed, the camera positioned near her window. Lauren slammed her laptop shut, her hands shaking. Someone had been in her house, or close enough to see into it. She dialed the police, but their investigation turned up nothing. The locks hadn't been tampered with, and there were no signs of forced entry. "Probably a prank," one officer said dismissively. That night, Lauren closed every curtain and double-checked all the locks. She slept with a heavy flashlight beside her bed. But as the hours ticked by, her fear grew. Around midnight, she heard it, a faint tapping on the glass. She bolted upright, gripping the flashlight tightly. The sound came again, deliberate and steady. She crept to the window, heart pounding. Peering through the curtains, she saw nothing but the empty street. Her eyes shifted to the house across the street. A faint light flickered in the same window as before. She could have sworn she saw a figure standing there, motionless. The next day, Lauren decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. Crossing the street, she knocked on the door of the vacant house. No one answered, but the door creaked open under her touch. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, the faint scent of mildew lingering. The furniture was covered with sheets, and cobwebs clung to the corners. She found herself drawn to the room with the flickering light. As she entered, the first thing she saw was the wall, a wall of screens. They displayed live footage from inside her house, her living room, her bedroom, her kitchen. Her blood ran cold. She approached the screens, her hands trembling. Beneath them was a table stacked with hard drives, labelled with dates stretching back years. Lauren's breath caught when she recognised herself in one of the videos. It was from her old apartment, footage of her cooking dinner, singing along to the radio. Another screen showed her college dorm room, and another, her childhood home. She stumbled back, bile rising in her throat. Someone had been watching her for decades. A noise behind her made her spin around. A man stood in the doorway, his face obscured by shadows. He wore a mask, a blank, expressionless face painted white. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said, his voice low and even. Lauren bolted for the door, her feet slipping on the dusty floor. The man moved quickly, blocking her path. "Don't make this difficult," he said, advancing. Lauren grabbed a lamp from the table and swung it, the glass shattering as it struck his arm. He stumbled, giving her just enough time to escape. She ran into the street, screaming for help. Lights flicked on in the neighbouring houses, and the man retreated into the darkness. When the police arrived, the house was empty. The screens were gone, the hard drives missing. It was as if the room had never existed. Lauren couldn't sleep for weeks, her every move haunted by the knowledge that someone was still watching. Then one morning, another package arrived on her porch. Inside was a photograph of her, taken from across the street. On the back, a single line was scrawled in red ink. "I'm still here." Jack's weekend hikes were his escape. The forest offered solitude, a break from the chaos of his city life. He loved the quiet, the way the trees muffled sound, the only interruptions coming from rustling leaves or the distant calls of birds. But this hike felt different. The trail was unfamiliar, winding deeper into a part of the woods he didn't recognize. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked behind a dense grove of trees. Its weathered wooden walls were grey with age, and the windows were so dirty they seemed opaque. Jack hesitated, his instincts telling him to turn back, but curiosity pushed him forward. He stepped onto the creaking porch and tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and mould. The cabin's interior was surprisingly empty, save for a table, a few chairs, and shelves lining the walls. But it was what was on the shelves that made Jack's stomach churn. DVD cases, hundreds of them, each neatly labelled with a name and a date. He scanned the labels, his heart pounding when he recognised the names of people from his life. His parents, his ex-girlfriend, his college roommate. His own name appeared repeatedly, spanning decades. He picked one at random, sliding the disc into a small, dust-covered player hooked to an ancient television in the corner. The video began with a shaky shot of a playground. Jack's breath caught as he saw himself, no older than 7, chasing his friends across the monkey bars. The camera zoomed in on his face, lingering as he laughed, oblivious to the fact that he was being watched. The scene changed, showing him at 16, sitting on a park bench with his first girlfriend. The camera remained hidden, capturing moments he'd thought were private. Jack felt a chill creep up his spine. Who had taken these videos? How long had they been watching him? He pulled out another DVD, this one dated a few weeks ago. The footage showed him in his apartment, sitting on the couch, eating dinner. The angle was low, as if the camera had been hidden in his living room. He felt nauseous. Someone had been inside his home. As he rifled through the DVDs, Jack noticed a disc labelled "Today." His hands trembled as he loaded it into the player. The screen flickered, and he saw himself walking through the forest just hours earlier. The camera followed from a distance, zooming in as he approached the cabin. The final shot showed him stepping inside. The video ended, leaving only static. A creak from the floorboards above broke the silence. Jack's blood ran cold. He hadn't seen a staircase, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was upstairs. He turned toward the door, but it was already closing, the faint glow of daylight vanishing as it clicked shut. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. No answer. His flashlight beam swept the room, catching shadows that seemed to move. He backed toward the door, but his foot hit something on the floor. Looking down, he saw a camcorder, its red light blinking. It had been recording him. The sound of footsteps descended from above, slow and deliberate. Jack grabbed a heavy chair, gripping it tightly as the footsteps grew louder. "I know you're here," he shouted. The steps stopped just outside the doorway leading to the next room. For a moment, there was silence. Then the camera on the floor began to whir, its lens turning to focus on him. Jack's breathing quickened as he swung the flashlight toward the doorway. A man stood there, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by a black hood. In his hands was another camcorder, the lens pointed directly at Jack. "What do you want?" Jack demanded, his voice breaking. The man didn't respond. He raised the camcorder higher, the red light blinking steadily. Jack's heart pounded as he stepped back, gripping the chair like a shield. The man moved without warning, fast and silent. Jack swung the chair, but it connected with empty air. The flashlight flickered, and the man was gone. The cabin seemed to close in around him, every shadow a threat. The camcorder on the floor continued to record, its blinking light the only constant. Jack bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting into the woods. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, his chest heaving, his hands shaking as he started the engine. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the hooded man, but the woods were empty. Back at home, Jack called the police. By the time they reached the cabin, it was empty. The DVDs, the camcorders, even the table and shelves were gone. It was as if the place had never existed, but Jack couldn't forget. That night, as he tried to sleep, his phone buzzed. He picked it up to find an email with no subject line. The attachment was a video file. He hesitated before opening it. The footage showed his bedroom, the camera angled from the corner of the ceiling. It zoomed in on him, lying frozen in bed, his eyes wide with fear. The final frame was a message written in red text across the screen. "I'm still filming." The alleyway was narrow and suffocating, a forgotten corner of the city where few dared venture. At its end stood a peculiar puppet shop with no sign and a cracked window pane. The children of the neighbourhood whispered about it, claiming the puppet's eyes moved when no one was looking. Nathan, a young journalist desperate for a story that would launch his career, dismissed the tales as mere folklore. But when two children vanished, and their descriptions eerily matched new puppets in the window, he knew he had to investigate. The shop was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of varnish and decay. Nathan pushed the door open, the bell above it letting out a hollow chime. Rows of puppets lined the walls, their faces frozen in expressions of joy, fear, and surprise. Their eyes, glossy and too lifelike, seemed to follow him as he moved. He shivered, but pressed on, his notebook ready. "Can I help you?" The voice was soft, almost gentle. Nathan turned to see the shop's owner emerge from the shadows, a gaunt man with a pale complexion and hands that seemed too steady. "I'm just curious about your work," Nathan said, forcing a smile. The man's lips curled slightly. "Curiosity is dangerous," he said, his eyes narrowing. Ignoring the warning, Nathan asked about the missing children, his voice steady despite the chill creeping up his spine. The shopkeeper's smile widened. "Would you like to see where the magic happens?" he asked, motioning toward a door behind the counter. Nathan hesitated, but nodded. This was his chance. The door creaked open, revealing a workshop lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls were covered in tools, scalpels, needles and brushes. Jars of paint sat next to containers filled with a viscous amber liquid. At the centre of the room was a large work table, and on it lay an unfinished puppet, its eyes wide and unseeing. "Do you know what makes a puppet truly lifelike?" the shopkeeper asked, his voice soft but menacing. "The eyes." He picked up a small jar and held it to the light. Inside, floating in the amber liquid, were what appeared to be human eyes. Nathan's blood ran cold. "You're mad," he whispered, taking a step back. The shopkeeper moved with sudden speed, blocking the door. "Madness? Number perfection!" He gestured to the puppets lining the shelves. "Each one retains a piece of their soul. The eyes are the window, after all." Nathan lunged for the door, but the shopkeeper was ready. A needle plunged into his neck, and darkness claimed him. When Nathan awoke, he couldn't move. His body felt heavy, his limbs stiff. He was seated, propped upright in a chair. Panic surged as he realized he was in the workshop surrounded by puppets. The shopkeeper stood over him, a chisel in hand. "You'll be my finest work," he said almost reverently. Nathan's vision blurred, but he felt every cut, every incision. The shopkeeper worked methodically, hollowing out his arms and legs, replacing bones with jointed wood. Pain blurred with numbness as the amber liquid coursed through his veins, preserving his body. When the shopkeeper leaned in, Nathan saw his reflection in the man's eyes, his own face, pale and lifeless, with wooden eyes staring back. The transformation took days. Nathan's consciousness faded in and out, trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The shopkeeper spoke to him constantly, detailing every step. "You'll see things others can't," he whispered, fitting glass lenses over Nathan's wooden eyes. "You'll be my eyes." When it was done, Nathan was placed in the window, his body posed and his expression carefully moulded. The shopkeeper stood back, admiring his work. "Perfect," he said. "You'll watch over them all." Nathan wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. His mind was trapped, aware of every second that passed. He watched as people walked by, oblivious to the horror behind the glass. Time lost meaning. Days blurred into nights. Occasionally the shopkeeper would bring in a new guest, and Nathan was forced to watch their transformation, unable to look away. One night, a child pressed her face to the glass, her eyes wide with curiosity. Nathan tried to warn her to make any movement, but his wooden eyes remained fixed. The shopkeeper appeared behind her, his smile cruel and knowing. "Would you like to see the magic?" he asked, opening the door. Years passed. The shop fell into disrepair, but the puppets remained. Locals avoided the alleyway, claiming they felt eyes watching them. Nathan's mind frayed, splintering like the wood that now made up his body. But deep inside, a part of him remained, trapped, aware and forever staring through wooden eyes. Detective Harris had seen more than his share of strange cases, but this one gnawed at him. Over the past 6 months, people had been disappearing from the outskirts of town. Students, drifters, a retired teacher. Their lives were wiped clean, leaving only whispers and rumours. Each trail, every clue, led him to one place, an unassuming building at the edge of town. A puppet shop, barely a blip on the map. By day, the shop's windows displayed delicate marionettes with painted smiles and intricate costumes. At night, the shop was dark, the glass reflecting only the dim glow of the street lamp. Harris had walked past it countless times, trying to convince himself it was just another dead end. But he knew better. Something was wrong. He felt it deep in his bones. One stormy evening, unable to shake the feeling, Harris decided to investigate. Rain hammered the streets as he jimmied the lock and slipped inside, flashlight in hand. The air was thick with the scent of varnish and decay. Rows of marionettes lined the walls, suspended by strings that disappeared into the shadows above. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. Harris swept the flashlight across the room, the beam catching motes of dust that danced like spectres. A creaking noise echoed from the back of the shop. He followed it, stepping cautiously. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Behind a worn curtain, he found a hidden door, slightly ajar. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But the faces of the missing haunted him. He pushed the door open. The hidden room was a workshop, but not for puppets. The walls were lined with jars of chemicals, surgical tools, and diagrams pinned like macabre trophies. In the centre stood a metal contraption resembling a spider, its limbs ending in needles and clamps. Harris's breath caught. He stepped closer and saw what he dreaded. Marionettes, each too lifelike to be mere wood and paint. One twitched as he approached, its head jerking to face him. "Help," the marionette whispered, its voice weak and broken. Harris recoiled, the flashlight shaking in his grip. He stepped back, nearly stumbling over a hidden wire. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. "Detective Harris," a voice drawled, smooth and cold. The man stepped into the light, a wiry figure with sharp features and a face that seemed to split into an unnatural smile. "You found my workshop." The man wore gloves stained with dark, crusted spots. "Impressive, isn't it?" "Monstrous," Harris spat, drawing his weapon. "You're going to pay for this." The man raised his hands, palms out. Now. Violence won't solve anything." With a flick of his wrist, he pulled on a set of strings that hung from the ceiling. Instantly, the marionettes in the room jerked to life, their movements grotesque and mechanical. Harris fired, shattering one of the marionette's heads. Beneath the splintered wood, something moved, a tangle of nerves and flesh, preserved and wired to the contraption. "They're alive, you see," the man continued, his tone almost conversational. "Well, mostly. The body must be hollowed, modified. The mind, it fights at first, but the strings take care of that." Harris lunged, but the marionettes swarmed him, their limbs stronger than they appeared. strings wrapped around his wrists, yanking him back. The killer stepped forward, eyes glinting with satisfaction. "You shouldn't have come alone, detective." Harris struggled, muscles straining against the wires. One marionette, its face frozen in a silent scream, leaned close. "He can hear us," it whispered, voice trembling. "He makes us do this." Tears welled in Harris's eyes. These were the victims, trapped, twisted into puppets for a madman's sick game. The killer approached, a scalpel glinting in the dim light. "Your turn," he murmured, slicing through Harris's sleeve. The detective fought, adrenaline coursing through him. He kicked out, knocking over a table. Chemicals spilled, igniting a small flame. The killer hissed, distracted. Harris seized the moment, breaking free and slamming into the man. The fire spread quickly, licking at the walls and consuming everything in its path. The marionettes convulsed, their strings burning. "End it," one gasped, as flames consumed its body. Harris grabbed the killer, dragging him toward the door. "You're done," he growled. The killer only laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. With a final burst of strength, Harris threw the man into the burning workshop. He stumbled outside, collapsing onto the wet pavement. The fire roared behind him, a funeral pyre for the lost souls within. Rain mixed with ash as he watched, numb and broken. In the aftermath, no bodies were found, only ash and charred wood. The shop was gone, but whispers persisted, of a man who escaped the flames, a shadow who still pulled strings from the darkness. Harris knew he would never forget the marionette's whisper, nor the faces of those trapped by strings they couldn't see. Clara's footsteps echoed on the cobblestone streets as she made her way to the heart of town. The puppet shop had always drawn her attention, with its colourful displays and whimsical figures. Mr. Felton, the shopkeeper, was known for his charming demeanour and skill with wood and paint. Children loved him, parents trusted him, and his shop had become a cherished part of their small town. But Clara's visit today was different. She was searching for answers. 2 weeks ago, her best friend Eliza had disappeared without a trace. Police searches turned up nothing, and people whispered of dark possibilities. Clara clung to hope, but it was slipping through her fingers. Then she saw it, a new puppet in Felton's window, its painted eyes wide and gleaming. The face was unmistakable. It was Eliza. Clara felt her knees buckle. She stumbled forward, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. It couldn't be. She pressed her hand to the glass, heart pounding. The puppet was posed delicately, one hand outstretched as if waving, a smile painted across its wooden lips. Clara's stomach twisted. The smile was wrong, too wide, too lifelike. She turned away, bile rising in her throat. That night she couldn't sleep. Images of Eliza's face, frozen in that grotesque smile, haunted her. By morning, Clara's fear had turned to determination. She had to know the truth. Armed with a flashlight and a resolve she didn't quite feel, she returned to the shop after dark. The streets were empty, and the town's usual warmth felt cold and distant. The door to the puppet shop was unlocked. Clara stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The marionettes on display seemed to watch her, their painted eyes reflecting the beam. The air was thick with the smell of varnish and something metallic. "Mr. Felton?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. She moved deeper into the shop, past shelves lined with puppets in every shape and size. Each was meticulously crafted, their expressions frozen in various states of joy and surprise. Clara's breath caught when she spotted a staircase leading down. She hesitated, but then heard a faint sound, like a soft, rhythmic tapping. She descended slowly, each step creaking underfoot. The basement was dimly lit by flickering lanterns. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with paints, carving tools and scraps of wood. In the centre of the room stood a large work table. Clara's blood ran cold. Lying on the table was a partially finished puppet, its limbs jointed but incomplete. Its face, it was Eliza's face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice made her jump. Mr. Felton stepped out of the shadows, a chisel in one hand. He smiled, but his eyes were empty, devoid of warmth. "You have a keen eye, Clara. Eliza was a masterpiece." You did this," Clara stammered, backing away. "Why?" Felton tilted his head, as if pondering the question. "Perfection," he said simply. "True beauty is fleeting, but with my art I preserve it. Eliza was special. Her spirit lives on in every stroke of paint, every carved joint." Clara's hand tightened around the flashlight. "You're sick." Felton's smile widened. "Perhaps. But you must admit, my work is unparalleled." He moved closer, his steps deliberate. "I've been searching for a new muse. Someone with fire, passion. You, Clara. You'll be perfect." She swung the flashlight, but he caught her wrist with a strength that belied his age. "No need to struggle," he whispered, pulling her toward the work table. "It will be painless. You'll be immortalized." Clara fought, adrenaline surging. She kicked over a jar of varnish, its contents spilling across the floor. Felton lunged, but she broke free, grabbing a carving knife from the workbench. "Stay back!" she shouted. He laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "Do you think you're the first to resist?" He raised his chisel, eyes glinting. In that moment, Clara saw the lantern's flickering flame reflected in the varnish. She acted without thinking, hurling the knife into the nearest lantern. It shattered, and flames erupted, consuming the varnish and spreading rapidly. Felton screamed, his arms flailing as fire licked at his clothes. Clara bolted for the stairs, the heat at her back. She burst into the night air, gasping. Behind her, the shop burned, smoke curling into the sky. People gathered, drawn by the flames, but Clara couldn't speak. She watched as the fire consumed Felton's twisted legacy. Days later, as the ashes cooled, authorities found no human remains. They dismissed Felton's disappearance as a tragic accident, but Clara knew better. She couldn't forget the look in his eyes, or the smell of burning wood and varnish. And sometimes, late at night, she swore she heard faint laughter, the echo of painted smiles that would never truly fade. Margot had always found the narrow streets of Bellevue both charming and suffocating. The town's old cobblestones were worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and the buildings leaned in as if sharing secrets. Every morning, on her way to work at the diner, she passed the small antique shop with its dusty glass display. The puppets and marionettes inside seemed to watch her, their wooden eyes frozen in expressions of surprise, delight, or horror. Most days, she averted her gaze, but today was different. There was something new, a puppet that looked eerily familiar. Margot paused, squinting through the grimy glass. The puppet was posed delicately, one arm raised in an almost lifelike wave. Its features were unsettlingly close to those of Ellie, a girl who had vanished from town 2 weeks prior. The resemblance made Margot's stomach twist. She shook her head, chiding herself for being paranoid, and walked on, trying to forget the sight. But as the days passed, she noticed more changes in the window. A puppet resembling Mr. Harlan, the grocer who had gone missing a month ago, appeared, its expression frozen in a grotesque smile. Her unease grew. One evening, after a long shift, Margot decided to confront her fears. It was a foolish idea, but curiosity gnawed at her. She approached the shop, the street deserted and bathed in the pale glow of street lamps. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of varnish and age. Rows of marionettes lined the walls, their painted eyes glinting in the dim light. "Hello!" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence answered. Margot's pulse quickened. She stepped further inside, her shoes echoing on the wooden floor. Something brushed against her arm, a string dangling from above. She swatted it away, only to realize it was attached to a marionette suspended from the ceiling. The puppet's head turned slightly, as if following her movement. "Margot," a voice whispered, sending a chill down her spine. She spun around, but the shop was empty. Panic rising, she backed toward the door, only to feel it slam shut behind her. She was trapped. The whisper came again, this time louder, echoing from every corner. "We've been waiting." The shadows shifted, and a figure emerged from the darkness. He was tall and thin, his face hidden beneath a cracked porcelain mask. The shopkeeper. In his hands, he held a bundle of strings, their ends disappearing into the darkness above. "You admire my work," he said, his voice soft and serpentine. "Few appreciate the artistry of control." "What are you doing to them?" Margot demanded, her voice cracking. She wanted to sound brave, but fear paralyzed her. The shopkeeper tilted his head, as if amused by the question. "They're not people anymore," he said, stepping closer. "They're vessels. Puppets who once thought they had control of their own lives. I simply corrected that." He gestured, and the marionettes on the walls twitched to life, their limbs jerking in grotesque movements. Margot stumbled backward, her mind reeling. "Why?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Everyone has strings," he replied, his eyes cold and empty behind the mask. "Some are visible, some are not." Before she could react, the shopkeeper lunged, wrapping the strings around her wrists and ankles. They burned like fire, biting into her skin. She tried to fight, but the more she struggled, the tighter they became. Her limbs moved against her will, manipulated by unseen forces. The shopkeeper pulled the strings with expert precision, forcing her to dance, to twist and turn, as if she were a marionette. The room spun, the walls closing in. Margot's screams were muffled by the strings that wrapped around her throat, cutting off her air. Darkness swallowed her. When she awoke, her body felt heavy, her joints stiff. She couldn't move. Panic surged as she realized she was standing, propped upright in the shop's window. The glass reflected her face, painted, frozen in an expression of horror. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The strings held her mouth in place, her body no longer her own. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of her fate. Days passed. The shop's display changed, new puppets appearing beside her. She recognized them all, familiar faces from town, each transformed, each bound by the shopkeeper's cruel hand. The people of Bellevue continued to walk past, oblivious to the truth lurking behind the glass. One morning, a new figure paused outside the window, a young man, curiosity flickering in his eyes as he stared at Margot's puppet form. Deep within, she felt a surge of despair. She wanted to warn him, to tell him to run, but all she could do was watch, her strings pulling her into place, her painted eyes forever staring. Leo had always been fascinated by puppets. As a child, he spent hours carving pieces of wood, turning them into crude marionettes that danced to his tune. But as he grew older, isolation warped his passion into something grotesque. Rejected by the world for his eccentricities, Leo withdrew, opening a small shop on the edge of town. He filled it with puppets, beautiful, lifelike creations that captivated anyone who dared step inside. The townspeople avoided him, whispering about the eerie shop and its strange owner. But Leo didn't care. He had his creations, and that was enough. Until one day, when he realized they were not. He craved more than lifeless wood and painted smiles. He craved perfection. His first masterpiece was an accident. A traveller had stopped by the shop, intrigued by the marionettes. The man lingered too long, his questions too probing. Panic and paranoia consumed Leo. He grabbed a carving knife, hands trembling, and struck. The traveller fell, blood pooling on the floor. As Leo stared at the body, an idea took root, a way to elevate his art. Leo worked through the night, using skills honed by years of isolation. He drained the body's blood and injected a rare neurotoxin, extracted from local plants. It paralyzed the muscles, preserving the form. He hollowed out the limbs, replacing bones with jointed wood. Every nerve was deadened, every joint carefully crafted. The next morning, a new marionette stood in his window, a handsome figure with eyes that seemed to plead for freedom. Word of the puppet spread. People marveled at its craftsmanship, unaware of its origins. Leo's obsession deepened. He began to hunt, selecting his victims carefully, those who wouldn't be missed, who wandered too close to his shop. He worked with precision, transforming flesh and bone into art. Each puppet retained traces of its former self, expressions frozen in fear or sadness. The shop became a place of whispered horror. Strangers who visited rarely left. But Leo was careful, methodical, until he met Anna. Anna was a travelling artist, her vibrant paintings capturing the essence of life. She walked into Leo's shop one afternoon, her curiosity piqued by the puppets. "These are incredible," she said, examining one closely. "So lifelike." Leo watched her, a spark of something long buried flickering within him. She saw his work. She understood. For days, he watched her from a distance, torn between admiration and obsession. He followed her to her rented room, learning her routines. Finally, he invited her to see his private collection. She accepted, oblivious to his true intentions. The basement was his sanctuary, filled with tools and half-finished puppets. Anna marvelled at the intricacy, unaware of the danger. "This is amazing," she whispered, tracing her fingers along a marionette's face. Leo stepped closer, heart pounding. "Would you like to be part of it?" he asked softly. Anna turned, confusion clouding her features. "What do you mean?" Before she could react, he pressed a cloth to her mouth. The neurotoxin acted quickly, paralyzing her. He laid her on the workbench, his hands steady. "You'll be my greatest work," he murmured, his voice trembling. But as he prepared the tools, her eyes met his, wide, terrified, and alive in a way his creations never were. Doubt crept in, making his hands shake. "Why?" her eyes seemed to ask, tears streaming down her face. Leo hesitated. For the first time he saw his work through another's eyes, not as art, but as horror. The realization shattered him. He dropped the scalpel, stumbling back. The marionettes around him seemed to watch, their expressions twisted. They whispered, not words, but memories of the lives he'd stolen. He tried to leave, but the whispers grew louder. Strings tightened around his wrists, pulling him back. The marionettes moved, their bodies jerking to life. They surrounded him, eyes burning with silent fury. "No!" he gasped, fighting against their pull. But it was useless. The strings wrapped around his limbs, forcing him to dance, a grotesque parody of life. The next morning, the townspeople noticed a new addition to the shop's window, a marionette with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. Its limbs were jointed, its expression frozen in terror. Leo had become part of his collection, the final touch in a twisted masterpiece.